Catastrophism was largely rooted in the teachings of the Bible, where it was common to read stories of floods, fires, droughts, plagues, and the scientists at the time who were proponents of catastrophism saw a connection to the biblical teachings and what we could observe in the known world. So, for example, one fossil hunter who found a fossil of a fish on a mountaintop would come to the conclusion that in the past there was some catastrophic flood, such as Noah's flood, and that's how the fish had come to arrive on that mountaintop. So both sides, both the proponents of gradualism and the proponents of catastrophism, argued without any real sort of decisive conclusion arrived at for some time, until one geologist named Charles Lyell expanded on Hutton's theory and said, not only do the processes of geology occur over long periods of time, but that the rates of which change occur now are the same rates of which change was occurring in the past. So, for example, what Lyell was saying is that if we can measure erosion at this point in time, the rate of erosion is the same rate a billion years ago, because environmental factors were the same. Wind could move at the same speeds, sand particles had the same texture, and so what Lyell basically did was say, if we can measure the rate of erosion now, if we can measure the rate of continental drift now, then that means that we can go back in time and figure out what the rates of erosion were then. And this information was very, very important, because basically what it did was it comes to the conclusion that the Earth is very, very old. Now, at the time, they didn't know exactly how old it was, but they knew that it was millions, if not billions of years old, which was in contrast to the biblical stories, which had placed the Earth at about 6,000 years old. And so we're talking about time scales that were now significantly longer than what scientists were looking at before. And so this gives people a lot of room to start thinking about, what was the Earth like 5 million years ago? What was the Earth like 20 million years ago? Whereas before they were talking about what was the Earth like thousands of years ago. So the whole time scale was shifted with Lyell's addition to Hutton's theory. So Lyell's theory became known as uniformitarianism, because it was saying that the conditions that exist on Earth now are uniform compared to the conditions that existed billions of years ago. With the knowledge that the Earth was much older than thousands of years and into the millions and perhaps billions of years old, scientists started to look at fossils in a different way. What they started to recognize was that fossils that were closer to the surface of the Earth and that were newer fossils tended to look more like things that we see on Earth now, and that the further back in time we go, the more different animals look, the more different plants look. And so this had scientists thinking that there must be some sort of pattern, there must be some sort of way that determines how life was changing. So essentially what scientists were trying to do was trying to find a way to explain how organisms were evolving. How over time were they developing modifications that made them look different than their ancestors. One theory of evolution was proposed by a French biologist, and excuse my French pronunciation, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And what Lamarck was saying is that organisms will use and disuse certain parts of their body. So this makes sense to us. A giraffe will stretch its neck to reach leaves at the top of the tree. The muscles will be strengthened by continual stretching. But what he said that was different was that not only could organisms use and disuse certain parts of their body and gain characteristics, for example, such as a strong neck, but that those characteristics could be passed on to that giraffe's children. So, for example, giraffes that were using their necks more than other giraffes would pass that characteristic onto their children. So giraffes that stretched their necks longer would have children that had longer necks. And those children who had longer necks would stretch their necks more than other giraffes. And so we have a sequence of events here where generation after generation, through use, organisms have acquired characteristics. So those offspring have acquired the characteristics of its parents through use and disuse. Now the opposite of how this would work is that if an organism doesn't use something, then its children will have smaller characteristics of that particular piece of anatomy. So for example, if I have a giraffe that's not stretching its neck, it will have children with smaller necks. Now, it doesn't take very much to prove that Lamarck's theory is not entirely correct. And what I mean by that is that we could take a mouse, and if I cut off the tail of the mouse, its children are still going to have tails. I can do this for thousands of generations of mice, and I will always get the same result. The offspring will always have tails, no matter how many times I cut off the parent's tail. Now, I would hope that all of you are starting to think about why that is. And I hope that you've come to the conclusion that even if you stretch your neck, it doesn't change your DNA. Even if I cut off a mouse's tail, it doesn't change the DNA. And so, even though scientists at the time didn't know about DNA, they could figure out that Lamarck's theory wasn't exactly what was going on. Because otherwise, we would have seen, for example, somebody like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was Mr. Universe and has huge muscles. We would expect that his children would automatically have huge muscles. Now we know that's not true. His children would have to work out, they'd have to go to the gym, they would have to use steroids to achieve the kind of shape that Arnold Schwarzenegger has. And so this led scientists to start to try and find another mechanism by which organisms could evolve. So at this point, I hope you remember that I said one of the myths of evolution is that everything starts and ends with Darwin. And I hope at this point you can see that there was a lot of foundation work that had to go before Darwin could come up with his theories. As I explained to you what Darwin's theories are, please don't think that this is the end of the unit. There's a whole lot more evidence that needs to be used to support Darwin's theory. At the beginning, we're going to talk about Darwin's formative years and how he came to the conclusions that he came to, because he is probably the most central figure in the theory of evolution. Though, as I said before, he is not the first person, he is not the last person in this story.